That sounds great. I know Stephen has done a lot for multi-cluster test framework. He's everywhere.
And we have Sen, so Sen can chime in on the first item of the day.
Steve Landau sounds good.
Okay. Lost my tab.
All right. Thanks, Steve, for all the hard work and more responsibility to you. Enjoy.
Okay. So I'm just gonna okay. And John, you said the other ones are not short, right?
No, I don't think so.
So
I mean, there's this
we'll
release
bring-
manager one that's probably short. It was just that we may want to start looking at it, and Iris or someone on their team is interested in volunteering. So,
see. Do we want to take that on? We don't have a huge attendance today. I don't see Iris on the call. Sorry.
No, Iris is has office hours in the Beijing time zone.
Yeah.
She's not usually at POC.
Yeah, she never joins.
But she is interested in doing it.
Last time I spoke with her, she said somebody on her team might be interested for next release.
Who is she working for now?
She works for Intel.
Intel.
Okay.
I can check with her. I have a meeting scheduled with her. UX does like an Asia-friendly meeting once a month, and that happens to be this week. So I can follow up with her at that time if that'd be worthwhile.
Yeah, that would definitely be worthwhile.
So we still need, I guess, 2 more, right? So this is our time to ask for anyone else who is interested.
So I know we have some engineer in mind that could help. It's just he hasn't gone through a single first PR with Istio community at the moment yet.
Okay.
I think, I mean, it will be perfectly fine to have him or her as a shadow this release if the intent is, that person will be continuing to work with Istio.
Yeah, so we should be able to get through the requirement of 1 single PR. Yeah, it definitely would be a more on a learning role, like Neeraj said.
So we will need someone then at least who is more experienced or who has done at least 1 release before. Or John or Brian, do you think things are automated to the point where others can just go?
You cut out there, Neeraj.
Brian?
Yeah.
Do you think things are automated enough that we can fully hand off the build process to somebody without prior experience? I think there's a sense of trepidation about that.
So I haven't done a release for a couple of releases, and the branch cutting and other things were added in the meantime. I think they're pretty stable. That said, Eric, myself, and a couple of others are regularly involved in the process anyway. So if they need any help, we can help.
Sam, can you chime in?
Yeah, I would say the branch cutting is relatively well automated, but Brian and Eric on a lot of steps have knowledge that we kind of have to reach out to for, and there's like a lot of manual stuff still.
Okay, well, in the interest of moving the agenda along, we're not going to try and resolve the third slot, but let's do some follow-ups offline and see if we can find someone. Okay, so going back to the agenda, Mitch, you want to do the roadmap UX?
Sure. You want to click that link or?
Yeah, I'll click it.
Okay. So I think you'll find that our 111 roadmap is very much just executing on the 2021 vision that we talked about a few months ago. Items are pulled pretty much directly off of that without too many exceptions. I still don't see the roadmap.
Louis, can you present the other thing?
Yeah, sorry. Second. Good, not good.
So I'll just kind of go down the line. You'll see that we have a lot of P0s. Our first on the list is getting an analyzer feedback into the status field. This is a carryover from 1.9. It's currently blocked on a refactor that Jason Wang is working on. Next up, we want to rationalize Istio control commands by role. Right now, Istio control has a lot of commands, some of which can be run by our application operators, some of which you need to be a control plane operator to run. And so we want to organize them in a way so that it's obvious who should be running which commands for our users, because their permissions to the cluster vary quite a bit. And that's a P0 for this release as well. We've already seen the Istio upgrade survey for 1.9. Istio upgrade surveys are now a regular thing that happen with every release of Istio. 1.10 has a link in several documents as well as in the Istio control command output. When you succeed in an upgrade, you're asked to fill out a survey. So that's going to be ongoing effort on our part. We also have some interview follow-up to the 1.9 surveys that was requested, and so I'll be heading up that in the 1.11 release. Next up, we've been talking a lot about feature maturity. We'd like to be able to tell a user, here are all of the non-stable things you're using in Istio. Currently, we do this, well, we have the technology to do this with annotations today. It's been disabled, and we'll get to that on the next item. But we need the technology to do this with APIs, labels, and other pieces. This is something that's come up in the TOC multiple times in recent weeks as a high priority. I do want to call out that we do not have an owner for this. Nathan Mittler was driving it for a while. Jason Wang was also driving it for a while. Both of them have moved on to other topics or other tasks. So we are looking for an owner in that important space. Next up, as a follow-up to that, we do have, alpha maturity analyzer that exists and is disabled. It's disabled. Well, it only works for annotations today, and it's disabled because so many of the things that we use by default in Istio are alpha. And so if you just ran istio-cutl install with no options, this analyzer would report all kinds of problems in your cluster, which is not a great user experience. So when we talked about it last in the TOC, I agreed to write suppression logic for anything that we use by default. and I'll be going through and doing that in 1.11 so that at least in the 1.11 release, we will be able to see what alpha annotations are being used. I do want to call out, though, that as we begin showing this to users, this means that we need to treat those things that we are using by default as though they were beta or higher. We need to follow beta deprecation rules, etc., because the user will be able to ask a question, what is alpha? They're not going to see those items in the output, which means that they have a reasonable expectation that we treat them as beta or better. Does that make sense?
Sort of. While individual features in the APIs are alpha state, saying that we treat the default behaviors of the runtime when the API is not set as beta, right? That's a confusing message for any user for any API. I don't think we can actually procedurally do that, even if it might be logically correct. I think we would just confuse the hell out of people.
Yeah.
I've never seen another API do that.
Okay.
Because that's also the equivalent of saying, like, there's a feature in the runtime that has a default behavior that isn't yet controlled by an API, but when we added an alpha API that you set it, then you have to treat the feature as beta. I just don't think we can do that.
That's a good point. I thought that what I had represented just now is what the TOC had asked for about 4 weeks ago with this when we pulled it out of 110. If I'm wrong, maybe we need another short design session, but I don't want to derail the roadmap for that purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we certainly should revisit the topic.
Okay.
I remember the discussion to some degree, but I don't remember that specifically being the totality of the conclusion.
Okay. So that needs revisiting before I'll execute on anything. Neeraj, were you trying to weigh in on something?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think the point was that there are frivolous warnings that are generated which we don't give an option for a user to opt out of, as in they can't do anything about it, right? So we need to make that output less noisy. I don't think that means that that particular feature by default becomes beta or higher.
Okay.
Right. So those two things are separate in my mind. And that's what I think Louis is also trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, they have to be, otherwise we wouldn't be able to progress them, right? We can't start with every runtime feature that gets an API added in beta by default.
If the annotations get removed when the pod restarts because it gets reinjected, we don't need to make a big deal about it. Right. If it would be preserved, then we would, because then the pod might not work after the upgrade. I think none of these have that characteristic, so I think we're safe.
And you said this is for annotations only?
At the moment, yeah. We again, if you look at the next item up on the agenda there, we'd like it to cover more, but today what we have implemented is annotations. Okay, I'll make sure to revisit that before we begin execution on it to discuss the status of these suppressed APIs. In the meantime, I'll continue along unless there's objections.
Okay.
All right, next up, we've again heard from TOC in the last few weeks that we need to support stable API promotion. We do not have the API machinery in place yet today to label, say, virtual service, or I know some of the security APIs are looking to be labeled as stable. And that's not just a maturity level that we put on Istio.io. That's actually referring to the Kubernetes API version string moving to just V1 instead of V1 beta, for instance. So that's some infrastructure we would like to have as a project. We do not have an owner in that space today.
Mitch, I thought I had signed up for that one and not the support beta API and Istio kettle, but maybe I'm misunderstanding something, because I was a little surprised to see this list that I was on the support beta APIs for Istio kettle.
Okay, that sounds like probably bad note taking on my part, Justin. I will fix that.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, we found an owner.
And lost an owner.
Yeah, that's not important though.
Okay.
We're moving
unless it's needed on the way. I'm happy to help out with that too.
We're moving an owner from a P2 to a P0, so that's a good trade for us.
Okay.
I'm going to move this to unowned. All right. Next up, external control plane troubleshooting. This is something that we have been targeting since 1.8, and there have been lots of architectural discussions, etc. We actually have the architecture in place now for the communication that we need to happen between an external control plane and Istio control. Thanks to Ed for working, made a ton of great progress in 1.10. Now that communication channel is in place, Ed has plans to make use of it across all of the eligible troubleshooting commands in Istio control. There are 1 or 2 commands that it won't work for. They're edge cases that we know about, but the vast majority it should. And so we want to make use of that immediately so that all of our users can make use of these troubleshooting commands, not just control plane operators. Now we're getting down into the P2s. We would like to have some opt-in data usage data collection, something that says how many times a various Istio control command was called, or how many times the various analyzers fired, to get an idea of what is useful for our users and what is not. This would be opt-in. Our users would need to explicitly send us a file containing this information so that we aren't doing any creepy, unexpected data collection. But a few of our users would be able to provide us with feedback on what's useful. And I'll be driving that as a P2 for this release, just as a design. We want to move slowly on this.
Mitch, my recommendation on this would be, if you're doing some surveys, try to tease this out if people are actually willing to opt in and actually send data to an open source community. It has been a hurdle in the past. I've not seen other open source communities do that. So if we do, we have to also figure out where we are going to house this data and who can have access to it.
Yes. Yeah, and the approach, like I said, this is a design task, so that is TBD. We sort of expected to bypass some of the concerns by keeping it incredibly simple, like a spreadsheet that we can store in the Istio community drive. What that does is it keeps us from having any one company having ownership over the data. It belongs to the entire community. And again, because it's totally opt-in, you have to explicitly send the file. There's a lot of awareness that the user has over what's being sent, etc.
Yeah, good. Makes sense.
And the last one on the list, newly unowned. In our discussion about API maturity, we heard, and I think Ed and I were both unaware of this, unfortunately. Istio still struggles with some of the APIs that have promoted from alpha to beta in the last year in the networking space, particularly commands like Analyze, which can accept config either from a live cluster or from static files. There's some difficulty with differences between alpha and beta in the static files, and we need to close that, especially as we start looking towards adding some stable APIs that needs to be functional for our users.
Is the issue only with static files?
So I only learned about this issue on Tuesday. John, you were the one who I think encountered it. Is that where you encountered it?
Yeah, it's only reading files. When you read from Kubernetes, it converts them.
Okay.
Which makes sense because, yeah, Kubernetes API server can do your up conversion, etc. normally. So yeah, that's the 111 roadmap. Any questions?
So of all the P0s, is there a kind of implicit rank? Are they listed in order of kind of perceived priority, or?
No, they are listed in the order that I happened to type them in last night as I gathered them from the spreadsheet. So there's definitely no order within the P0s. There probably should be.
Yes.
And that's something I've had a chats with a few other people in the community about, even across working groups. As the working groups get pretty thin, you'll notice that there are not a wide variety of names on our roadmap this release.
Yes. No.
In more than one working group. There could be some value to having a cross-project priority list of P0s to understand what the relationship, environments is coming next. I'm sure they have something really important related to revision-based upgrades because those are really important for our users. So to know what the relative priority between that and stable API promotion is would help organize our labor a little bit more.
In advance of that, which I'll probably ask Shweta to help do. Do you guys want to try and order your list in the UX working group, at least based on your perceptions of priority?
Yeah, we should do that. I'll call it out in reverse, though. We sort of expected to hear from the TOC which things are most important. I have to imagine that's got to be API stuff that the TOC is most interested in.
That would have been my feedback, yes. Probably API promotion. I think the surveys are really useful. It's hard for me to balance between analyzers and feature maturity. I don't understand totally. I mean, I get the concept of rationalize commands by role. I'm just trying to map it into feedback that I've heard about the product in my head.
I think where you put feedback there is users expecting commands to work and finding that they don't have permissions to run them. This isn't super common because we don't have a lot of users running external control plane in open source today. But I know, like at Google, we use external control planes and have had users expect commands like proxy status to work,
yes.
And they do not. So I guess there's two efforts there. One is make as many of them work as possible, and that's Ed's work on external control plane troubleshooting. The other is for the remaining commands that are just never going to work for all users, make it clear which users should expect those to function.
Yeah, I mean, both of those sound useful. I think probably the external control plane troubleshooting is, some vendors will be highly motivated by that. We're using external control plane. Other TOC members, how do you see the priorities?
So I guess I would chime in with the analyzer status. I guess I haven't need to find out the status myself in the past few releases with Istio. I guess part of the reason is it's been working pretty well. So I certainly agree with what you said, like be able to have stable API promotion and upgrade survey. Those are super important because we constantly hear our users complaining about upgrades and also our APIs, clarity around our API. I was just wondering about the value of the analyzer status.
Yeah, I think we could probably move that down to a P1. Ed, is that good with you? Cool. And I'll reorganize that. I did want to call out with regard to the API, since we're hearing that there's a lot of importance there. There were 4 or 5 people who have been very opinionated in the TOC meeting about API status and maturity. We agreed to handle it in the user experience working group. Last week when we began discussion, we had only 2 of the opinionated people. And I worry that if 2 of us come to a conclusion and bring it back to the TOC, that's not a useful consensus for us to present.
Yeah, I think I was supposed to go. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say.
I was just saying, I was intending to go, and I had a conflict, unfortunately. So I am interested in trying to help guide that as much as I can, Mitch.
Okay, thanks, Sven.
Yeah, Mitch. I mean, feel free to announce and schedule a one-off meeting on the topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Make sure the people who've been squeaky wheels show up, and then just make sure in Slack that people know that this meeting is going to happen. And
okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
I was just gonna add same. Feel free to tag me if you need help. And the other thing is, it looks like the feature maturity API labels, we really want to have an owner there. So if moving this priority gets us an owner, that's good. If not, I guess we can go and look out and see if there are other other folks who are available to work on it. It looks like that's pretty high up, right?
Yeah, I could talk to Jason about moving. He's worked on both the analyzers and status as well as the feature maturity. The challenge there is he's probably 3 months invested in the refactor. And so I'm a bit hesitant to pull him out of that with all of the context that he's built up, etc. It sounds like he feels like he's pretty close to completing the refactor. And that would be a lot of lost progress.
Okay.
Anyways, I know there's another roadmap after this, so if there's no other questions, then I think we're good here.
No, this is really good, Mitch. I think it covers a lot of pain points that the users have.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just echo everyone else. I'm really interested in all the feature maturity stuff, API maturity, suppressing alpha maturity, all that. Yeah, it's really important. So yeah, this stuff's good.
Thank you.
Yeah, and please tag us if you need us, because there's a lot of work group meetings. It's harder sometimes to, make a priority to go. But if you tag any of us, we will definitely make an effort.
Okay. Yeah, and I think a one-off meeting is a good idea, especially this week where we have our Asia-friendly meeting time, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Pacific time, which is probably not going to be popular with a ton of you.
7 p.m. Pacific's not too bad in Hawaii. So.
Oh, there you
Exactly.
go. Hey, I feel bad for Ed. He tunes into it every month at 10 p.m. his time. So major props to him for empowering our Asia contributors.
Yawn.
I am actually on vacation, unfortunately, on Wednesday. But I could. Well, maybe I could tell.
But I think a one-off meeting is probably
one-off.
the best. Yeah.
One-off.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you.
I'm just going to make a note for Shweta to come back when we do look maybe at some cross-project prioritization, because I think there's some items in here that are pretty valuable. And I captured the kind of the general TOC feedback is we're super interested in seeing feature maturity stuff make progress, API and feature maturity stuff. Okay. It said environments working group, but it's not actually on the agenda today. Or am I blind?
We can make it next week as well.
So it wasn't planned to be on the agenda today.
I think it was technically, but we will be happy to do it next week.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to scratch that completely. Injected gateways, John?
Yeah, can we actually switch the order and do the other one first?
Sure. Breaking change to startup global, is that the one?
Yep. So what happened was in the last security release last week, we fixed a major issue with the multi-network gateway. In the process, we unknowingly broke the .global support. So a while back, I think it was 1.7, we stopped documenting having any code whatsoever anywhere in Istio or Istio.io about this .global stuff, but some people still have these custom Envoy filters that do this. So we have no test for it whatsoever, which is how it broke, obviously. And the change that we made basically just completely breaks it because it depends on some Envoy filter that we don't even use anymore because we changed how we do the multi-network. So I was wondering if there's any guidance on like what we should do here. It was something that was technically not supported and it's using Envoy filters and doing these hacky things, but it was fairly common. So is it enough to just go and probably put out an announcement saying, hey, we broke this, you shouldn't have been doing it anyways, and here's what you should be doing instead? Or should we go further and, you know, try and make this supported again somehow?
Just to be clear, this has been discovered that it was broken probably as far back as like 1.7-ish. We never actually had tests for it even before we kind of refactored multi-cluster. So the fact that we broke it was completely unknown at the time. But we did add a release notice pretty much as soon as we discovered that and backported it, indicating that .global is no longer supported.
But it was working up until last week again. Like, I don't know if it, I think I do recall it broke, but maybe someone fixed it or something.
Oh, possibly. I had no idea.
So maybe it was working but not supported, and now it's not supported and broken.
So somebody was actually using it in a post 1.7 release.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah, that's what I found out. We got a report from someone.
So John, in the newer releases, it looks like after 1.7 or 1.8, I don't see star.global being mentioned anywhere in the documentation. Is that correct? Or do we still mention it in the documentation but don't support it?
No, there's nothing documenting star.global. There's nothing in Istio at all. Like it's completely gone. So I guess the question is, do we still care about it at all? Or is this just something that we should kind of make a note of?
I mean, it feels like.
Go ahead, Naresh.
Go ahead, Louis. No, I was going to say it feels like. Finish it up.
No, it's okay. I'm going to let you finish. Sorry, that wasn't the Kanye impression.
All right. So what I was going to say is, I mean, I've been following this in the past 2-3 releases at least, like John said. Star.global is not there. We cleaned up our documentation. So the current multi-cluster support works without it. So if a user still uses the new release of Istio and wants to get this functionality, what are they trying to do? Like, I'm trying to understand what is the use case here. And if there is no tangible or real use case, I would be okay dropping it.
So I guess, John, maybe describe what it used to do.
Yeah, it used to be people would have, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Nate, because I'm not actually an expert here, they would have their internal, like it's basically, if you're familiar with MCS, how you can have by default, everything is just the cluster local, and then you have cluster set.local, which is the entire mesh across all clusters, except we call it a .global. So .global hits the entire mesh, whereas cluster local hits just your own cluster.
In other words, without global, there is no way to hit all of them. Is it correct?
I don't think so, because now it uses the pass-through on the gateways, so it just uses the local cluster name, and it acts like everything is the same. Whereas before, I think the .global was used with core DNS, so those services came in, everything would sort of get aggregated under that .global domain name, and if you used that, then it would route locally or remote or whatever.
Yeah, and just to be clear, this .global is only used in a multi-master setup. If you had like a primary and remote, cluster.local would get you mesh-wide anyway. So it really only applies to multi-master configurations.
Do we know how many people still are using this? Like, is it just one, or is it more than one?
Core DNS is also deprecated, as far as I know. I mean, that whole plugin was written by Sriram and never maintained, really.
No, but it's not only core DNS, Niraj.
Okay.
Yeah, without core DNS, you can still using .global, and in fact, you don't have to use .global. You can use whatever name you like. I believe we use that in GlueMesh too.
So one thing I'm kind of proposing is, so in supporting Kubernetes multi-cluster services, we're going to need to support cluster set.local, and it's actually kind of one of the bullets here. So I suspect that if we kind of sort out the plumbing for aliasing effectively cluster.local with cluster set.local, we can probably do the same thing with anything we want. We can kind of like make a generic aliasing mechanism where if people really need for some reason to have .global, it will work. It obviously might not work the way it used to because cluster.local will still get you mesh wide. But if they actually have clients that are, you know, hard coded to .global, it should at least work. It's just a note there because we're gonna have to solve cluster set.local anyway.
To step a bit back here, so a real problem I think is how do we integrate or interoperate with external DNS servers or people who do not use Kubernetes DNS and run in other environments where you have, you know, kind of random domains, random DNS servers where you programmatically control them or do whatever you want. So it's a matter of interoperability and you know, kind of not being completely tied to the behavior of, you know, the default install basically.
Yeah, I think that's totally the value of that global or whatever host user might be able to specify, because the caller maybe reside outside of Kubernetes, they may be inside of Kubernetes and be able to configure a particular address, the same destination address, regardless where your clients are pretty important.
So maybe it's not a global problem. The problem is interoperability and how do we support external DNS, external things, and not tightly coupled systems.
Yeah, I thought .global was really specific to, you know, one of the earlier multi-cluster implementations. So, you know, I can see how you would want to use it, you know, for external workloads, but that to me seems like it's more just abusing the feature than actually what it was intended for.
Right.
I see it the other way around. I mean, I think it was intended as a way to use external DNS, but it was, you know, we provided a core DNS implementation or hack because we didn't have any.
Sorry, I meant, yeah, it was intended to call out, but not to have external services call in using that. So like, for like VM workloads, that was what I interpreted Lynn's comment as.
I think
I still don't think we actually have a succinct description of how .global was intended to be used, right? Was the option we would give you cluster.local, right, which by default would be mesh wide, but you had an option to make it literally cluster.local, and then you could use the .global name, right, to get global behavior, even if that was the setting.
No, that's actually not quite true. So like the example, yeah, it's
there wasn't that much thought put into this.
So if you had like multi-cluster with say one control plane but a bunch of remotes, cluster.local would still get you mesh wide. It really was only a hack for DNS to make multi-master work.
Why?
That was the only way to make it work, to be honest.
Why?
Yeah. You know what? Because
it was a hack. Right? It was a hack to make things work.
Oh, okay. But like varying the behavior of DNS because of the installation of the control plane topology seems like an anti-pattern, right?
Yes.
Totally. It was broken in many ways.
That's why we got rid of it.
For that reason alone, we should deprecate it, right? Because it's like if you switched your control plane topology in production, you could break.
Yeah.
Right? Is that
So
what we're
I think
saying?
we are broadening this discussion quite a bit, right? So this request here is very clear, which is, do we want to preserve the old behavior, which in my opinion was hacky, wrong, and we deprecated it for the right reasons? So I don't think we should try to support it. We can bring it back in some other fancier, better way, which actually might make sense. But in the old form, for me, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, so some small doc maybe
how
on the
do we
release
do
note that says, hey, this is broken, but it was never actually supposed to work anyways. And then here's the new link to the new docs.
Sorry, I pasted a doc link for where it was documented for 1.6.
Yeah, I'm gonna
I don't know if it was past that.
I'm going to present it.
As long as there is a non-hacky way to do the equivalent thing in 1.8, I think it's perfectly fine.
So everything, Louis, by the way, about this is alpha or experimental, including the core DNS plugin, which was the key mechanism that we said that how this will all work. The core DNS plugin that was written.
Is it alpha or experimental or both at the same time?
I think we just deprecated. So while there was no other alternative, we deprecated support for core DNS plugin. So if you go to that repo, so this was pretty bad in terms of management. So I think the feature might have become like alpha, but some of the core pieces it needed were just removed. And I'm guessing Sven is agreeing with me.
Yes, it was a bit of a mess. And yeah, so the problem is, yeah, how do we get anyone that was using it over to the new stuff?
So I have a problem with this interpretation of core DNS. I mean, there are projects like Kube External, I think, or that provide equivalent functionality with proper DNS servers. Yes, the core DNS hack, I mean, the plugin was really kind of a hack, but I don't think the equivalent functionality provided by proper tools is bad or is something that is not viable.
Yeah, I think we'd be fine having, some doc with a proposal for some exporting DNS or custom DNS, but like the way it was all set up was never that.
I agree. I mean, the core DNS plugin was definitely a hack. The replacement with what John is saying with the agent intercepting DNS is one solution. Having the synchronizer that is pushing the DNS entry into Google Cloud DNS or whatever DNS, real DNS you have, it's another solution. So they're kind of proper solutions for split horizon DNS that we're discussing here, or whatever it is. It's not even split horizon. It's basically having a global DNS, a real DNS server to provide the entries.
I don't know if that's how this was really intended to work, though, because this was really just resolving a specific domain suffix to Kubernetes or to Istio services, and then was wired in directly with the Kubernetes cluster DNS to as a delegate. So, and I mean, it's not really like a true DNS server. It's really, sort of, popsicle sticks and bubblegum kind of.
No, yeah, but that is because you need to test it. You have the requirements of testing, and you cannot really have an external prover, managed DNS that you put in the unit test or in the prow. So, but what I'm saying is the proper solution equivalent is to actually have a proper DNS server with a proper domain, foo.com, and then have a synchronizer that is pushing entries into foo.com proper DNS, which is global DNS server, and then everything is the same thing. But in practical terms, to implement it in Istio, you need to have it working kind, and for that, you are limited in what you can do. And
yeah, to me, that just seems kind of out of scope of core Istio, and something that someone could take this and write it themselves and do this kind of stuff.
I mean, yeah, there are products out there which do global DNS, right? So we don't have to solve those things. I think again, so what question that Sven had is the thing that we need to solve, or we need to say, hey, if you were using .global suffix for doing multi-cluster routing, here's the new way, which means you will have to now change your clients, or yes, you have to change some of your route rules or service entries so that they no longer need to have the .global suffix, because things will now actually work without requiring extra configuration. So they don't need to add configuration; they actually need to remove configuration.
Well, and potentially change applications to not call .global anymore.
Yes. So actually, yeah, you're right. So I mean, it's a bit of a churn, but I don't know if you want to give them a smoother migration path.
That's why I was asking if we knew how many people this was affecting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the solution, right, if you want to keep doing it, is say, here's an Envoy filter that you can patch your system with that'll do exactly the same thing that we were doing before we removed it, right? And then they've got an out.
Well, it was an Envoy filter, and we broke the Envoy filter because it depends on an existing filter that we removed. So
Right.
They can. I mean, there is an out. They can turn off the patch and go back to the insecure mode where they expose every service on the public internet with no authentication. But that's a pretty bad
that was
recommendation.
that was the SNI forwarding.
Yeah.
So, John, you're saying they can't use the old filter anymore?
No, that's what we broke.
And-
So the old filter depends on some config that we don't do anymore. We completely changed the filters. So.
Okay.
So can they upgrade the old filter to use the new format to get it working, or it's just completely broke?
If they want to do the old way, they can turn off an environment variable in pilot that will revert the CVE fix for a 10 score CVE. So they can make it work, but they would be kind of not so smart to do it.
Yeah, would be, yeah. So I think that global, there's definitely value for consistent user experience when the client is outside of the mesh, was the client is inside mesh. They can call the single service, destination service, with whatever name they like. It doesn't have to be .global. It could be like somebody was saying food.com, right? So if I'm a client, I'm outside of the mesh, I'm calling my services running inside the mesh. I'm calling it whether it's on my laptop or whether it's a pod within Kubernetes. It's the same endpoint for me. I think that's huge value to our user.
But Lynn, that's not what .global did, right? What you are saying is a stable DNS name everywhere that can route irrespective whether it's one cluster, multi-cluster, VMs or not.
Yes.
But
That was not that global did initially, but I think it has that intention when Shuran designed it in the first place. So the .global, I think it's a bad naming, and also it was built on the core DNS implementation, which is bad, which we have a replacement, right, with DNS proxy. It's more mature, so I think we should still enable people to do things if they want a consistent naming.
if you do it in DNS proxy, though, I mean, you cannot have clients outside resolve it, right? You need proxy to resolve it.
No, external DNS will be the equivalent.
Exactly. So that's what I'm trying to say. You still need more solutions.
And there are solutions that exist. There is a Kubernetes project to sync Kubernetes to an external DNS server with about 20 DNS servers supported. Let me find it.
Right, and we expect that to work with cluster set.
Nothing works.
Right, so the one
with cluster set.
No, I know, but do we expect it to? Right.
It's not supposed because you are synchronized with the real domain. So you have example port.com, and then names show up with they can get ACME certificate. You have your own.
Oh, that's a different. Right, that's external to internal. Right.
Yeah.
This is the thing we're specifically looking at here is internal to internal.
Exactly. I mean, it's a new feature that can be added, Lynn and Costin, and if you create a doc for it, we can look at it. But I think internal to internal doesn't make sense to support it right now. Or continue to support it.
Or support it as something differentiated from cluster set.
Yeah.
To Google, it's corp.google.com, basically. So that's more or less equivalent what global is. Corp.google.com or prod.google.com or those names that,
Yeah, right, but really, if you looking at what it does, right, it just says, I want the definition of global to be whatever Istio thinks cluster.local is.
Kind of.
Right? That's basically what cluster set is. Or would be.
Cluster set .local will be, kind of well-defined name, but it's not equivalent to prod.google.com.
Yeah, but
anyway,
subtle
I think
difference.
he was right here because that's the intent with behind all of this was the same as cluster set.local before cluster set.local entered the picture.
Right. Like Istio changes under the hood the definition of cluster.local to be global, right? Because it merges across all the clusters that it's looking at. This was just trying to reflect that back into DNS. But because we couldn't mess with the actual underlying DNS, we had to put in another namespace, hence global. But that's the intent of cluster set, sort of.
I think that's pretty much it.
So from DNS perspective, there is a subtle difference between cluster set.local and custom name. By definition, anything .local cannot be, global.
Right, but people have service entry to do that custom.
They do have, yes, that's true. They could do
Right,
the
and-
equivalent with a lot of configurations. That's true.
And frankly, we'd like Kubernetes to fix its shit a little bit around the definition of service with endpoints, right? So that,
Yeah.
But they don't want to be a DNS programming system, so they've kind of held off doing it, which means people can go use, they can still go use their own DNS to do this. So I guess it would be good, Nate, to figure out from the multi-cluster services folks. I guess one, are they seeing people using cluster set.local outside of Kubernetes names, outside of Kubernetes clusters? Is that happening? Do we know that?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's mostly in mesh traffic.
Yeah,
Right, so
that's
there's
exactly the challenge, right? If people are not using it outside of Kubernetes cluster, then when the client is outside of the cluster, they're not going to call cluster set.local.
Okay. And so just remind me, what was the Envoy filter for? Like, I understand what the core DNS plugin was doing. What was the Envoy filter doing?
So the Envoy filter was just substituting .global with .cluster.local. So when it comes in to the other gateway, it routes to the correct service. But if you're using pass-through on the gateways, you can just call everything with cluster.local, right? And you have all the endpoints from the other cluster in your local cluster. So it's just going to route out there. And if it ends up going through the network gateway, then it ends up in the right spot.
So very much an Istio internal implementation detail.
That's how I interpret it.
Okay, so there are actually incidentally two different features, right? One which is to make multi-cluster routing work the way it's supposed to, and the other one is let people use DNS for things that Istio thinks are merged names.
I think the second is an accident. First is the only thing that was intentional.
I agree with what Niraj said.
Certainly the second thing sure seems like it was only an experimental. Now, there's nothing to say that somebody can't go write a core DNS plugin that scrapes Istio, right, and introduces DNS names for what Istio thinks cluster.local is, right? There's nothing technically
Absolutely,
preventing.
they could use the existing one as a starting point if they want to. That's why I was just saying I don't know if this really needs to be part of core Istio because anybody can go and bolt this on.
Yeah, I thought the challenge is build it on with the environment variable and not breaking security vulnerability.
Okay. And that was, again, mostly for people who were running stuff outside of a Kubernetes cluster, correct? And our preferred answer for them anyway is please run inside the mesh.
Yeah, but they need the transition time, right? I mean, it's going to take time for people to transition to the mesh gradually. So the transition phase, they're going to run into that a lot.
Okay. So the user who reported the issue, which of the two features did they report the issue against? They reported against the DNS resolution not working from
No, not about the
from
DNS.
Okay.
The actual Envoy config itself. The Envoy filter basically doesn't work. It tries to do something that's completely
So they had a custom Envoy filter. They used the Envoy filter that we showed them from this.
Yeah.
And it didn't work. So they should just be fixed by the bug fix, right?
Which bug fix?
So what aspect of the Envoy filter behavior was that user dependent on, and why?
Yeah, they need the translation from .global to cluster.local.
Right, and who was using .global? Why were they using .global?
Probably
they
they
had
read
some
our
app
docs in
in
1.6.
But they
that
had
was the
some
only
app
way to
in
get
the
that was the only way to get multi-cluster routing work in 1.6, right, Louis? And the app was making a call using .global domain to reach from transparently from one cluster to the other.
The app was inside the mesh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Has the customer resolved their issue? Have they just reverted back to cluster.local?
Yeah, it looks like they're switching to cluster.local probably.
Okay.
There were also during the 1.7x timeframe, a couple folks raised a similar issue because .global was broken then as well. Every single issue I've seen raising this is in mesh traffic.
Okay. And we just tell them to switch back to cluster.local.
Yeah, effectively.
Okay. So that's from a support perspective, that seems like a perfectly reasonable remediation for anyone who's in mesh. So the only people we don't have a great answer for if we remove all of this is people who are relying on .global outside of the mesh.
And as you know, I have not seen an issue raised on that to this point.
So Louis, that only worked if they were outside the mesh, yet they were using core DNS or the KH DNS for resolution, right?
Yes. No. Understood. Obviously, it's a pretty edge case, right? But we're contemplating making a deliberate regression, not a regression. Well, depending on your point of view, some customers will think it's a regression. The question is, how many of them are there, and what are their cost to remediation? So it doesn't sound like we have a high number. The dependency of the one case where we don't have an easy remediation is they were already dependent on an experimental feature, right? The core DNS integration. Because they had to perform this step to make it work, in addition to taking a dependency in the kube DNS from the workload outside the mesh. Is that a fair assessment?
That's the stance we took, yeah. That it was experimental in the first place.
Okay, then I think it's reasonable to deprecate. I mean, to just say that it was an experimental feature, and it has been logically and semantically replaced. And if you want, going forward, you should look at MCS and DNS support for MCS if you want to do this from stuff outside the mesh, right, which is already an edge case. So, John, you were asking how should we communicate this, I guess, is the...
Yeah, it sounds like we should just say what you said on the release notes is probably reasonable.
Okay. Nate, do you think you could write something up for the release notes?
So I've already, I posted a link to the previous release note. I mean, if we want to expand beyond that, we can.
Oh, sorry, did I miss that?
Might scroll up, I'm not sure.
And that was in 1.9.
Backported to 1.8.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah, maybe we should just call
said
out that
we said it was not going to keep working, and we stopped it working. But people still got hit by it. Yeah, I mean, we could put something in saying, you know, that global no longer works. If you have it.
Yeah, I mean, this would have been a good thing to have in a. Right. I was just going to say, like, I mean, having pre-upgrade validation, right? It could have looked for the signs that people were trying to use this. So yeah, you know, there was, I guess we could say there was a miss on that front. But sure, it does look like we've deprecated. We could, I mean, the other thing I would maybe just say in the release notes is that that support was alpha and the core DNS integration was experimental, if we wanted to get into that level. But I think this is fine.
Yeah, so the problem with this, certainly we read this too, but we're still using global in GlueMesh on 1.8, using the new model, Nathan, you wrote, which is multi-primary. So you could potentially do multi-primary with .global or whatever hostname you like with DNS proxy. That's the confusing part, right? So this application was specifically about replicated control plane, which we're not using. And it seems to indicate, you know, that's not supported, but it didn't really say anything about people still config .global with the new multi-primary model.
But I mean, to be fair, .global was never supported. It was effectively end to end. It was experimental. It was never actually tested, etc. So, I mean, we're not really changing anything here. Specifically, I mean, we're not unsupporting it, I guess.
Okay, so essentially this .global is still saying towards the replicate control plane, and then for the multi-primary, people could build on .global if they choose to. Is that fair, based on what you said?
I mean, it's just not something we actually support. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
All right, since we're way over time, what's our next step here? Do we want to have yet another note, or are we good?
We can add clarification to this note. It looks like Lynn was saying, there was some confusion, and we can publish it again if that's needed through our social media channels. But it feels like the first attempt was good. It just wasn't maybe clear enough. And then obviously we didn't have automation, so people didn't. You know, nobody needs upgraded nodes. So I'll just clarify the language.
Lynn, does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah, I just didn't want to say, you know, you can't build that global solution on top of Istio. I mean, vendors should be able to freely do that.
Yeah. No. I mean,
yeah.
People can do whatever they want with their DNS.
Yeah.
There's just limits to what we will support.
Yeah, sounds good.
So we're just going to. So I guess the plan is to just republish this note in the 1.10 notes, maybe with some refinement.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yep. I gotta drop, folks.
All right, time to call it.
Yeah.
15 minutes over.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good deal.